When the storm chose her, she was 9 months pregnant, stranded on a rooftop, surrounded by floodwater in the dark. And the man who saved her was the most dangerous person in Louisiana. Elena Whitmore had nothing left. Her husband had vanished with every dollar they owned, leaving her alone in a flooding farmhouse as Hurricane Celeste tore the coastline apart. She was exhausted, soaked, and terrified, not just for herself, but for the child she was about to bring into a world that had already decided to swallow her whole. Then a helicopter cut through the storm, and the man inside it was not a rescuer. He was a predator, a king of shadows, a man the FBI had been hunting for 11 years. But he landed anyway. If this story already has you gripping your seat, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about survival, power, and the people who show up when the world goes dark. The wind had been screaming for 6 hours before the water came through the floor. Elena felt it first, a cold pressure against the soles of her feet, spreading fast, swallowing the baseboards and then the legs of the kitchen table before she even had time to register what was happening. The lights had gone out 3 hours ago. Her phone was at 4%. The battery-powered radio in the corner had been cycling through the same emergency broadcast loop since midnight. Mandatory evacuation, Category 4, do not remain in flood zones. But mandatory evacuations required a car that worked and a husband who hadn't already taken both. She didn't have either. The farmhouse on Route 12 outside Delacroix had been in Derek's family for 40 years. He told her that on their third date, leaning across a restaurant table with that easy smile of his, the one that made her feel like the only woman in any room he'd ever walked into. He told her a lot of things on that third date. Most of them turned out to be constructed the way expensive facades are. Beautiful from the street, hollow behind the walls. But she couldn't think about Derek right now. Derek was gone. Derek had been gone for 4 days. Elena grabbed the waterproof bag she'd packed 2 hours ago when she still thought she might be able to drive out. Diapers, formula, her prenatal records, the $300 in cash she'd hidden inside a gutted paperback novel on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, the one place she was certain Derek had never looked because Derek didn't read. She slung the bag over her shoulder and started moving toward the staircase, each step sending a shockwave of pressure up through her hips and into her lower back. The baby had dropped 2 weeks ago. The midwife at her last appointment had said any day now with a cheerful certainty that felt like a taunt. The water was at her ankles by the time she reached the stairs. She climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, one pressed against the swell of her abdomen, and she did not let herself think about what would happen if the water kept rising. She did not let herself think about the nearest neighbor being 3 miles down a road that was now a river, or about the fact that her last text to her sister in Baton Rouge had gone unanswered for 9 hours, or about the way her phone screen had flickered twice in the last 10 minutes, a warning she recognized and chose not to examine too directly. The second floor was dry, for now. She sat on the edge of the bed in the master bedroom and pressed her back against the headboard and listened to the stormwork on the house. The roof groaned. Something large, a tree limb maybe, or a piece of fence, struck the side of the building and made the walls shudder. Rain came through the window she hadn't been able to fully close because the frame had swollen in the humidity months ago, and Derek had kept saying he'd get to it, and she had kept believing him, and now water was tracking across the floor in thin silver ribbons. She opened her phone. 3%. She opened her contacts and scrolled past names that belonged to a life that felt borrowed. Derek's college friends, Derek's business associates, the couples they'd socialized with, whose loyalty, she now understood, had always been directional. She found her sister's number and called it and got a fast, busy signal, which meant the cell towers were already compromised. She tried 911 and got a recording. All lines are currently engaged due to emergency volume. Please hold or try again. She ended the call. 2%. Outside, the wind shifted, and for a moment, just one, the roar of it dropped to something almost bearable, and in that gap she heard water. Not rain, not the creek that ran along the south side of the property. Something heavier, moving faster, the sound of a great volume of water displacing everything in its path. and she understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the oldest part of human instinct, that the levee somewhere upstream had given way. She was off the bed before the thought fully formed. The water was on the stairs when she opened the bedroom door. Not seeping, moving, a dark sheet of it pushing up through the stairwell with a low, muscular current that hit her shins when she stepped onto the landing and nearly knocked her sideways. She grabbed the door frame. The bag slipped from her shoulder and she caught it with one hand and pressed the other against her belly and breathed. One breath, two breaths, the kind of deliberate breathing the childbirth class instructor had taught her in a church basement in October before everything fell apart. She was not going to panic. She was not going to drown in Derek Vale's inherited farmhouse. She found the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway and pulled the cord, and the folding ladder came down, and she climbed it with the bag hanging from her teeth and both hands working the rungs, her arms shaking, her back screaming at her, the baby pressing low and heavy against her pelvis with every rung she cleared. The attic was small and airless and smelled of old insulation and mouse droppings, and she didn't care. She crawled to the small vent window at the gable end, the one that looked out over the rear of the property, and she worked the latch until it gave and swung the panel out and pushed her upper body through into the storm. The water was everywhere. She could see it in the lightning, vast and black and moving, covering the road, covering the fields, covering the neighbor's fence line 100 yards away. The farmhouse was an island. The yard was gone. The truck Derek had left in the driveway was gone, or invisible, or beneath 3 feet of water she couldn't see past in the dark. The wind tore at her hair and drove rain into her face hard enough to sting, and she gripped the window frame with both hands and did not look down. 1%. She opened her phone's emergency function, the one that could broadcast a GPS location signal even with no bars, and she activated it and pressed the phone against her chest under her shirt to keep the screen dry, and she looked up at the sky and she waited. She waited for 20 minutes. Then she felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A vibration that didn't belong to the storm. A rhythmic percussion against the air that cut under the wind's pitch. She scanned the darkness. Nothing. Then a light, pale and searching, sweeping across the surface of the floodwater from the west, moving fast, dropping altitude. A helicopter. She screamed. She couldn't hear herself over the storm. She pulled her shirt sleeve off one shoulder and waved it above her head, and she screamed anyway, because the body does what the body does when survival becomes the only available imperative. The light swept toward the house, past it. She screamed again, waved both arms. The helicopter banked. She saw its running lights tilt, and then the searchlight found her. It held. She went still, illuminated, blinking into the white beam, one hand raised, the other pressed flat against her belly. The helicopter descended. Julian Romano had not intended to be in the air during a Category 4 hurricane. He had not, in fact, intended to be in Louisiana at all. His plans for the previous 72 hours had involved a flight to Miami, a meeting with 3 men he'd been circling for the better part of a year, and a resolution to a particular problem that had been generating friction in his operation for longer than he found acceptable. Those plans had been suspended when the storm changed course 12 hours faster than any of the models predicted, when the Miami flight got grounded, and when he found himself stranded at his compound outside Chalmette with a helicopter, a pilot, and a reason to stay out of the city that was solid enough to keep him from attempting the drive. The pilot's name was Carver. He'd been with Julian for 9 years, long enough to know the difference between a request and an instruction, and he'd looked at Julian the way a man looks at something inevitable when Julian told him to go up. "In this," Carver said, "there are people stranded on the levee road." Julian had been monitoring the emergency frequencies out of habit, the habit of a man who had built his career on knowing what was happening in his territory before anyone else did. "Take us up. Stay low. Low is how you get killed in a storm like this." Carver went up. They'd pulled 2 families off rooftops in the first 90 minutes, a woman and her 3 children from a split level on Parish Road, and an elderly couple from a farmhouse to the north whose first floor was completely submerged. Julian had helped them in through the side door, wrapped them in the emergency blankets from the storage compartment, said nothing while they cried or prayed or made phone calls that didn't go through. He wasn't there to comfort them. He was there because his territory was flooding, and the people in it needed moving, and he had the means to move them, and that was the sum total of the calculation. He did not think of himself as a person who performed acts of charity. He thought of himself as a person who maintained order in the spaces he controlled. Tonight, the order required keeping people alive. They dropped the families at the evacuation shelter at the high school on Route 23 and gone back up, and Carver was scanning the south sector when the emergency GPS beacon appeared on the navigation display. "Got a signal," Carver said. "Farmhouse, Route 12, single point, stationary." Julian looked at the display. The signal was south of the levee breach. Deep water territory, the kind of flooding that would be 10-12 feet in the low spots by morning. "How far?" 8 minutes. "Go." The searchlight found her and Julian's first reaction. The immediate, unfiltered one that arrived before any subsequent processing was that he was looking at a woman who should not be alive. She was hanging out of an attic vent window with water already lapping at the eaves of the house. 9 months pregnant, no coat. Her face turned up toward the light with an expression that was not relief and not terror, but something carved from the middle of those two things. Something that looked like a person who had stopped expecting to be found and was adjusting in real time to the fact that they had been. "Can you get lower?" Julian said. "Not without risking the rotor on the ridgeline." "Then I'll need the harness." "Julian." "The harness, Carver." The roof was slick and the pitch was shallow, and Julian moved across it in a crouch, with the rescue line clipped to his belt and the rain hitting him sideways with enough force to lean into. He got to the vent window. Up close, she looked younger than he'd expected and more frightened than her face had been letting on from above. And she was shaking. Not cold, or not only cold, but the kind of shaking that comes from adrenaline sustaining a body past its reasonable limits. "Can you climb?" he said. She looked at him. He was aware of what he looked like. 6'2", rain-soaked, black clothes, face that people who met him professionally tended to avoid prolonged eye contact with. He was not the reassuring type. He had never cultivated that quality, and he saw no particular need for it now. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Then come out, slow." She came through the window sideways, which was the only way the math of her body and the frame allowed it, and he caught her arm when she cleared the ledge and kept his weight shifted backward toward the ridge, and she grabbed his jacket with both hands, and they stood there on the slope of the roof in the middle of a hurricane for approximately 2 seconds that felt longer than that, calibrating. "I've got you," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It wasn't the kind of thing he said. "I know," she said, which also wasn't the kind of thing people said to him. He got her up the slope and clipped the secondary line to her harness, and Carver held the hover steady while they made the transfer, which was not graceful and was not safe and worked anyway. Julian got in last and pulled the door shut, and the noise dropped from catastrophic to merely severe, and Elena Whitmore sat on the floor of the cargo compartment with her back against the bulkhead and her bag in her lap and looked at nothing. Julian sat across from her. He studied her the way he studied everything, without expression, taking inventory. "When are you due?" he said. 5 days ago, she said. A beat of silence. "Who's meeting you at the shelter?" She didn't answer immediately. That gap, that small specific hesitation, told him something. He'd been reading hesitations for 20 years. He let the question sit. "No one," she said finally. "Husband?" She looked at him then. The look was complicated in a way he hadn't expected, layered. Anger and exhaustion, and something beneath both of those that he recognized, because he'd seen it in the mirror at various points in his life. The look of a person who had been made to feel like the fool in a situation where someone else was doing the fooling. "He left," she said. "During the storm." "Before it." She paused. 4 days before. Julian held her gaze for a moment, then looked forward at Carver's shoulders. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? Men left, women were left. The mechanics of that particular transaction were older than anything he could comment on usefully. "What's your name?" he said. "Elena. Elena Whitmore." Something moved behind his eyes when she said it. Something faint that he couldn't place in the noise and the dark and the immediate operational concern of getting her somewhere dry and medically attended. He filed it away, the name, the flicker of almost recognition, and turned to look out the window at the black water spreading below them. At the shelter, he helped her down from the helicopter and turned her over to the volunteer medics, who moved her quickly and efficiently and without asking him questions he didn't want to answer, which he appreciated. He watched from 20 feet away while they settled her into a cot and took her blood pressure and spoke to her with the particular gentle competence of people who do crisis work without drama. He should have left then. He didn't leave. He stood in the entrance of the high school gymnasium and watched Elena Whitmore speak to a medic with that same exhausted, unsentimental steadiness she'd had on the roof, and he tried to locate the name Whitmore in the precise and organized index of his memory. It was there. He was certain of it. A thread attached to something he'd encountered years ago. Something that had the texture of unfinished business or buried history, or both. He took out his phone and opened a secure channel to his research associate in New Orleans and sent one message. Whitmore, Louisiana, family name. Run it back 20 years. The response came 40 minutes later, while he was sitting in a folding chair in the corridor outside the gymnasium drinking bad coffee from a paper cup. It was not what he expected. It was considerably more than what he expected. He read the document 3 times. Then he looked up at the gymnasium door, behind which Elena Whitmore was presumably trying to sleep through contractions on a cot, surrounded by 200 displaced strangers, and he understood, with the quiet certainty that arrived when a pattern completed itself, that the storm had not delivered her to him by coincidence. Nothing in his world arrived by coincidence. The Whitmore name ran back 60 years in Louisiana legal history, winding through trust documents and land holdings and a family fortune of a scale that people outside a small number of financial institutions had never been aware of because the family had been methodical about its privacy. The kind of privacy that gets methodical when the money gets large enough. The trust had been locked, legally frozen, for 2 decades following the disappearance of the last documented members of the Whitmore bloodline, the investigation into which had been quietly shelved after 2 years of producing nothing useful. The estate value, locked and accruing, was somewhere north of $400 million, and the lock had one release mechanism. 1. A direct blood descendant. Julian lowered the phone. Inside the gymnasium, the medic opened the door and looked out and found him immediately, because he was not the kind of man who disappeared into a crowd. Mr. Romano, the medic said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had just looked him up and arrived at an opinion they were managing. She's asking for you. He looked up. What? The woman you brought in, Whitmore. She's asking for the man from the helicopter. A pause. She said to tell you her water broke. Julian Romano stood up from the folding chair with a steadiness that was entirely performed, because beneath it something had shifted. Some calculation he hadn't finished making had just gotten significantly more complicated, and he walked toward the gymnasium door. Behind it, a woman he'd known for less than 2 hours was about to give birth to a child that, if the documents he'd just read were accurate, was about to become the sole heir to a fortune that 6 very dangerous people had spent 20 years trying to locate. And somewhere in the flooding dark outside, her husband, the man who had left her 4 days before a hurricane, was not, Julian was increasingly certain, simply a coward who had run from a storm. He was something else entirely. And he would be coming back. The baby came at 3:47 in the morning. There was no drama in the arrival itself, like no cinematic moment of sudden silence or orchestrated relief. There was only the raw animal fact of it, Elena's body doing what bodies do under pressure, working through the final hours with a grinding, pitiless efficiency that left her wrung out and shaking on a cot in a high school gymnasium, while the storm finished its business outside and 200 displaced strangers slept badly around her behind a curtain that a volunteer medic had rigged from a folding room divider and a bedsheet. Julian stood outside that curtain for the duration. He didn't know why. He had asked himself the question twice and gotten no answer that satisfied him, so he stopped asking and stood with his back against the cinder block wall and his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and listened to the sounds coming through the thin partition with an expression that Carver, who had seen Julian Romano in interrogation rooms and boardrooms and the aftermath of very bad decisions, would not have recognized. It was not concern, exactly. It was something more animal than that. Something that had been activated by the documents on his phone and hadn't fully resolved yet. When the medic came through the curtain and told him it was done, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a girl, both of them exhausted but stable. Julian nodded once and said nothing. The medic waited, as if expecting something more. Julian looked at her until she went back through the curtain. He stayed until dawn. When the storm cleared enough for the shelter to open its exterior doors, and the first gray light came through the high gymnasium windows, Julian walked back through the curtain. The medic was packing equipment. Elena was lying on her side on the cot with the baby against her chest. The baby's face turned inward, both of them still with the particular stillness of people who have used everything they had and are now simply existing in the aftermath. Elena opened her eyes when she heard him. "You stayed," she said. Her voice was scraped raw. "I had nowhere else to be." She studied him. He'd been studied before by prosecutors and rivals and men who wanted to understand whether they were in danger, but the way she looked at him was different. Not calculating, not afraid, just direct. The look of a woman who had recently passed through something that burned away whatever filter she'd been using to manage the social presentation of herself. "You read something," she said, "on your phone last night before they called you in." He kept his face neutral. "You were watching me." "You have a tell," she said. "Your jaw. When something surprises you." "Nothing surprises me." "Something did last night." She shifted carefully, holding the baby closer. "What did you find out about me?" He could have deflected. With most people, he would have. Instead, he pulled the folding chair that the medic had left beside the cot and sat down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her steadily. "What do you know about your mother's family?" he said. She blinked. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I know. My mother died when I was 11. Her family, I don't know much. She didn't talk about them. My father said they'd had some kind of falling out before I was born, that she'd cut ties." Elena paused, looking past him at the gymnasium ceiling. "He said they were old Louisiana money and that she wanted nothing to do with any of it." "Do you know her maiden name?" "Whitmore, same as mine. I took it back after—" She stopped. "I was in the process of changing it back when Derek—" "It doesn't matter." "Yes. Whitmore. Your mother's name was Catherine Whitmore." "Catherine Eloise Whitmore. Yes. Her parents were Gerald and Maura Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore built a financial holding company in the 1960s that grew into something considerably larger than the public record shows. The family controlled interests in 4 parishes, 2 private ports, and a network of real estate holdings that were deliberately fragmented across separate legal entities to limit visibility." He watched her face. "They disappeared in 2003. Both of them, within 6 months of each other. No bodies were found. The investigations ran cold." The stillness that came over her was not the stillness of surprise. It was something older. The stillness of a person who has spent years not asking a question because they were afraid of the answer. "I was 12 in 2003, she said. "I know." "Derek knew my mother's name," she said slowly. "He knew her family name. When we met, he seemed so interested in my background. I thought it was just—" She exhaled. "I thought he was interested in me." Julian said nothing. He let the implication finish building itself in the space between them. She looked down at the baby. The baby's fingers were curled loosely against Elena's collarbone, impossibly small, impossibly specific. "The trust," Elena said. Not a question. $412 million as of the last valuation, locked for 20 years pending identification of a direct blood descendant. He paused. "There are DNA verification protocols built into the trust documents. A descendant of Catherine Whitmore would qualify, and a child of a descendant would be a secondary qualifier under the terms." Elena was quiet for a long time. The gymnasium was getting louder as people woke, and the shelter staff began moving through the space with coffee and packaged food. A child somewhere near the far wall was crying with the persistent, rhythmic cry of a child who has been crying for a long time and expects to continue. "Derek knew," she said. "That's what I think. He planned this. I don't know how long, but the timing, 4 days before the storm." Her voice had gone flat and cold in a way that was more frightening than if it had cracked. "He took everything 3 days before the hurricane was projected to make landfall here. The accounts, the car, the emergency fund I thought he didn't know about." A pause. "He knew about the emergency fund. He'd been watching your finances. He'd been watching everything." She looked up at Julian. "He left me here to die." The word die landed in the space between them with a specific weight. Julian didn't move. "The question," he said carefully, "is what he planned to do after. If I was dead." She said it without flinching, working through it with the methodical focus of a person who doesn't have the luxury of falling apart. "If I was dead and the baby was dead, the trust would have gone to, what? Other claimants? Legal challenges?" With the primary line eliminated, there are provisions for collateral beneficiaries. The legal process would have taken years, during which time various parties might have leveraged the frozen assets in ways that don't appear in the trust documents. People who Derek was working with. That's my current hypothesis. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't categorize. "You've been investigating this since last night." "I had people working on it, yes." "Why?" The question was simple and direct, and he didn't have a simple and direct answer that was completely honest. He had a partially honest answer, which was that the Whitmore fortune intersected with financial territory he'd been monitoring for other reasons. He had a less honest answer, which was strategic interest. And he had an answer he hadn't fully examined yet, which was that he had stood outside a curtain for 6 hours for reasons that were not entirely professional. "Your situation overlaps with some concerns I have in this region," he said. "Our interests align." She read him the way she'd read him on the roof, quickly, without excess. She didn't believe him entirely. He could see that. She believed him enough. "My daughter," Elena said. "What?" "You said a child of a descendant would be a secondary qualifier." She looked down at the baby. "She qualifies." "Yes." "Which means she's in danger." "Which means," Julian said, "that we need to move you somewhere that isn't a public evacuation shelter." She nodded slowly. Then, without warning, she said, "What do you get out of this, Julian Romano?" He hadn't told her his name. He held very still. "I looked you up too," she said. "While I was waiting. The medic had a tablet. Your helicopter has a tail number." A pause. "I know who you are." "Then you know why the answer to that question is complicated." "Complicated men saved my life last night." She shifted the baby again, carefully. "I don't have the luxury of being particular about complicated." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll have the car ready in 20 minutes, he said. "Can you travel?" "I can do what I have to do." He believed her. "What?" The safe house was 40 minutes north of the city, in a part of the parish that the flooding hadn't reached. A converted property behind a tree line that looked, from the road, like nothing worth stopping for. Inside it was clean and functional and equipped in the particular way that Julian's properties were equipped, which was to say with the understanding that the people who used them might need to stay for reasons that hadn't been anticipated in advance. Elena moved through it with the careful, measuring attention of someone cataloging their environment. She noted the exits. She noted the cameras at the corners. She noted the man posted at the front door and the second one she could see through the kitchen window doing a perimeter walk. She said nothing about any of it. Julian put her in the room at the back of the house, the one with the strongest exterior walls and the window that faced the interior courtyard rather than the road, and a woman named Solis, who worked for him in a capacity that didn't have a clean title, arrived within the hour with supplies, diapers, formula, clothes for Elena in approximately the right sizes, a medical kit, and a satellite phone. "It's for you," Julian told Elena, setting the satellite phone on the dresser. "The only person who can call in on this number is me. You can call out to whoever you need to, your sister, anyone. Am I a guest or a prisoner? You can leave whenever you want. But you'd prefer I didn't. I'd prefer you were alive in a week, he said. Staying here improves those odds. She sat on the edge of the bed with the baby in her arms and looked at him with that level, unsentimental gaze, and he had the specific sensation, unfamiliar, slightly uncomfortable, of being seen rather than assessed. My sister's name is Renee, she said. She's in Baton Rouge. She doesn't know I'm safe. Call her. After I do, she stopped. There are things I need to tell you. About Derek, about the months before he left. She paused. I thought some things were coincidences. I think I was wrong about what a coincidence looks like. Get some sleep first. I'm not going to sleep. He looked at the baby, who was sleeping with the absolute commitment of a creature that knows no other mode. He looked back at Elena. Then tell me, he said, and pulled a chair from the corner and sat down. She talked for 2 hours. The picture that assembled itself from what she described was not the picture of a man who had fallen out of love, or panicked under financial pressure, or made a series of selfish decisions under stress. It was the picture of a campaign, methodical, patient, built on foundations laid years before Elena had understood that anything was being constructed. Derek Vale had come into her life 3 years after her father's death, when she was grieving and isolated and rebuilding. He had known, before their first date, that her name was legally Whitmore through her mother, that her mother had died intestate with no formal documentation of her family origins, and that Elena herself had never investigated the Whitmore background in any meaningful way. He had known these things because someone had told him. Elena didn't know who, but she'd found a phone in his desk drawer 8 months ago, a burner, cheap, with a number she didn't recognize. And when she'd confronted him, he'd told her it was for work, and she had chosen, because choosing otherwise was too large and too frightening to believe him. She hadn't believed him. She had pretended to believe him. She told Julian this without self-pity, with the flatness of someone reporting facts about a stranger. He listened without interrupting. He didn't tell her that she shouldn't blame herself, or that she couldn't have known, or any of the other things that people said in these situations that were technically true and completely useless. He just listened. And when she was done, he asked 3 questions, and the answers to those questions tightened the picture into something actionable. The burner phone. The financial advisor Derek had insisted they use, a man named Harlan Fitch, who Elena had met twice and found vaguely oily in a way she hadn't been able to articulate. The 3-day trip Derek had taken to Shreveport in February that he'd said was for a client, and that she had, at the time, believed. Julian sent messages on his own phone while she spoke. Quietly, without making it theatrical, just a man entering information into a system that would process it. When she finished, she looked at the baby, who had woken up and was making the pre-cry faces of an infant approaching a need. I need to feed her, Elena said. Julian stood. I'll be outside. Julian, he paused. What's your read? She said. On how much time we have before Derek figures out I'm not dead. He considered the question with the honesty she seemed to require. If he had people monitoring the shelter registries, he already knows. He watched her absorb that. If he didn't, he'll know within 48 hours when the flood casualty reports start getting consolidated. She nodded. Then we have maybe 2 days. Maybe less. Okay, she said. Not okay like it was fine. Okay like a soldier acknowledging an order. Then you'd better start telling me what you know about Harlan Fitch. He almost said something. He caught it. Get her fed, he said. Then we'll talk. He went into the hallway and closed the door and stood there for a moment with his back against the wall and worked through the geometry of the situation with the methodical precision that had kept him functional in circumstances considerably less complicated than this one. The problem was layered in a way that he found professionally interesting and personally inconvenient. The personal inconvenience was new. He didn't examine it directly. He pushed off the wall and went to find Carver. Harlan Fitch had an office in the Garden District and a face that looked like it had been arranged by committee. Pleasant in a generic way, the kind of face that deflects specific memory. Julian knew the type. He'd employed the type. Men who operated at the edges of legitimate structures, doing the paperwork that kept larger operations invisible. The file his people pulled on Fitch in the first 12 hours was a layered thing, each level revealing another level beneath it. On the surface, a registered financial planner with clean credentials and a client list that included a predictable range of mid-tier Louisiana professionals. One level down, an informal relationship with a real estate holding company that appeared to have no direct connection to anything notable until you cross-referenced its secondary shareholders against a separate entity that had attempted, unsuccessfully, to file a legal challenge against the Whitmore Trust 8 years ago. 2 levels down, a burner phone number registered to a prepaid account purchased at a gas station in Metairie 18 months ago, which matched the exchange that Elena had found in Derek's desk drawer. Julian read this in the kitchen of the safe house while Elena slept in the back room, finally surrendered to the exhaustion that 2 days of sustained crisis will eventually enforce regardless of will. Solis was on the door. Carver was on the perimeter. It was as controlled a situation as the situation allowed. His phone rang. A number he recognized as belonging to a man he had dealt with twice in the past 5 years. A Baton Rouge attorney named Steele, who occupied a specific and useful position at the intersection of legitimate law practice and the kind of work that didn't get written down. Julian answered. "Someone's asking questions about the Whitmore flood casualty lists," Steele said without preamble. "Specifically asking for confirmation of a female victim, 9 months pregnant, last known location Route 12 outside Delacroix." "Who's asking?" "It's going through a private investigator. The PI's client is shielded, but the PI has a prior relationship with a financial advisory firm in the Garden District." Julian's jaw tightened. "Fitch. That's my read." A pause. "Julian, whoever this is, they're moving fast. This inquiry was filed this morning. The storm's barely over. They've been waiting. That's what it looks like." "Steele," Julian lowered his voice, though he was alone in the kitchen. "How many people know the inquiry was made?" "At this point, me, the PI, whoever's behind the PI, and whoever they've talked to." A pause. "And now you." "Keep it that way." "There's a price for that." "There's always a price for that. Send me a number." He ended the call and sat with it for a moment. Then he went back through the hallway and opened the door to Elena's room quietly and looked in. She was asleep on her side, the baby in the portable crib that Solis had assembled beside the bed, both of them breathing in the deep, uncomplicated rhythm of people who have, at least temporarily, run out of resources for vigilance. He closed the door. He went back to the kitchen and opened his laptop and began building a parallel structure, a set of legal and financial countermeasures that would take time to assemble properly, but would, once assembled, make Elena and her daughter significantly harder to get at through the channels Derek and Fitch were likely using. He was 2 hours into this when he heard the sound. It was subtle, a shift in the ambient pattern of the house, a micro change in the quality of the silence outside that his body registered before his conscious mind caught up. He was moving before he completed the thought, crossing the kitchen in 4 steps, reaching the hallway as Solis came through the front door, with her hand already raised in the gesture that meant contact, exterior, unknown number. "East side," she said quietly. "Single vehicle. Killed its lights 200 yards out." Julian looked at her. "Wake Elena." "Julian? Wake her and get her to the interior room. Now." Solis went. Julian went to the front window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. The tree line was dark. The driveway was dark. He could see the shape of the vehicle Solis had flagged, parked off the road, partially obscured, engine off, watching. His phone buzzed, a text from Carver, who was somewhere in the dark outside. One occupant, male, not moving, just watching the house. Julian typed back, "Plates, 30 seconds. Then, rental. Baton Rouge Airport. Rented yesterday morning. Yesterday morning. Before the storm cleared. Before the roads were passable. Someone had rented a car at a Baton Rouge airport in the middle of a hurricane and driven south as soon as the roads allowed, looking for a woman on a flood casualty list." Julian stared at the shape of the car in the dark. Then his phone rang. Not the main line, the secondary number, the one that had fewer than a dozen people in the world who had it. He looked at the screen. The name on it made something in his chest go absolutely still. It was a name from 7 years ago, a name attached to a situation he had resolved, or believed he had resolved, with the finality that his particular methods usually produced. A name that should not have had any connection to Elena Whitmore, or the Whitmore Trust, or Harlan Fitch, or any of the threads he'd been pulling on for the last 12 hours. He answered, "Romano." The voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who believed he was in a position that allowed for smoothness and patience. "I think it's time we talked about what you found in that helicopter." Julian's eyes stayed on the car in the dark outside. "You've been watching me," Julian said. "I've been watching the situation," the voice said. "You're a variable I didn't anticipate, but every situation has variables." A pause. "The woman is alive. That's a complication. The child is a complication. But complications can be managed if the people involved are reasonable." "Are you suggesting I'm reasonable?" "I'm suggesting you're pragmatic, which is better." Another pause. "The Whitmore estate is worth $400 million. There's enough in that number for everyone to walk away satisfied, including you." Julian said nothing. "Romano, the people behind this have been patient for 20 years. They will not be stopped by a man who happened to have a helicopter on the right night." The smoothness in the voice had acquired an edge, something careful and cold beneath it. "This is a professional courtesy call. Step away from the woman. Step away from the child. What happens next doesn't have to involve you." Julian looked at the car that had been waiting in the dark, the car that was still there. "I have a question," Julian said. "Ask it." "The man in the car outside my property right now." Julian's voice was even and quiet. "Is he yours?" A silence, brief, fractional, but there. "What car?" the voice said. And that fraction of silence, that small, perfect tell, told Julian everything he needed to know about how many layers this had, and how long it had been running, and how many people were involved in the patient, methodical destruction of a woman who had spent her entire life not knowing she was a target. He ended the call. He walked back to the hallway. Solis was coming toward him with Elena behind her, Elena carrying the baby wrapped against her chest, moving fast and quiet in the way that people move when they understand the situation without needing it explained to them. She looked at Julian's face and read it the way she'd been reading him since the roof. "We're leaving," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Where?" He had a property 2 hours west, smaller, harder to find, the kind of place that didn't appear in any database his professional adversaries were likely to have access to, because it was held through 4 layers of shell entities and had been off the map for 6 years. "Somewhere I know," he said. She held his gaze for 1 second, then she shifted the baby's weight and said, "Tell me what you need me to carry." They were out the back of the house in 4 minutes. Carver had the second vehicle, a nondescript SUV, plates clean, running on the service road behind the property. Julian went last, pausing at the back door to look through the house toward the front window, where the curtains showed nothing but dark. The car was still there, still watching. He pulled the back door shut and moved. In the SUV, Elena sat in the rear seat with the baby and didn't speak for the first 15 minutes. Julian was in the front passenger seat, monitoring the navigation and the mirrors and the phone simultaneously, and the road unspooled, wet and empty ahead of them through the post-storm dark. Then she said, "Who called you?" He turned his head slightly. "Someone I believed I'd dealt with." "Believed?" "Yes." "What does that mean?" He looked at her in the rear-view mirror. She was pale and running on nothing, and her eyes were clear and direct and waiting. "It means," he said slowly, "that the network behind your husband is older and larger than I understood when I started pulling on it this morning." He paused. "And it means that the man who built it is someone I have a prior relationship with. A bad relationship. An unresolved one." She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound, and she adjusted her hold without looking down. "Julian," she said. "What?" "Is this the part where I find out I'm in more danger than you told me I was?" He considered the honest answer. The honest answer was that the situation had just transitioned from something manageable into something that required a complete reassessment of every assumption he'd made in the last 12 hours. The honest answer was that the name on his phone had changed the entire geometry of what they were dealing with. The honest answer was that Elena Whitmore and her daughter were not just the targets of a financial scheme. They were the center of something that had been running for 2 decades, and the people behind it were not the kind of people who stopped. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. "Okay," she said again in that same soldier's voice. And in the dark, with the wet Louisiana road ahead of them and the unknown car somewhere behind them and a name from 7 years ago sitting in Julian Romano's chest like something that hadn't finished detonating, the last road back to the life Elena Whitmore had known closed behind them both, and neither one of them looked back at it. The property west of Grosse Tete was the kind of place that existed in the gap between recorded history and working memory. A timber frame house set back from a gravel road behind a stand of live oaks that had been growing there since before anyone currently alive had been born. Julian had acquired it through a series of transactions that left no clean paper trail and had used it exactly twice in 6 years, both times for purposes that required the specific quality of invisibility it provided. It had no name. It didn't appear on any map he knew of. The nearest neighbor was a half-mile east and kept to themselves in the way that people who have chosen to live a half-mile from their nearest neighbor generally do. They arrived at 4:20 in the morning. Carver cut the headlights at the tree line and rolled the last 100 yards by feel, which he could do because he'd been here before and because Carver had the particular spatial memory of a man who had spent years navigating situations where lights were a liability. Elena carried the baby through the dark without being asked to. Julian unlocked the front door and cleared the interior in 90 seconds. Old habit, non-negotiable, and then came back to the entrance and said, "It's clean." And she walked in with the steadiness of a woman who had stopped expecting to be somewhere comfortable and had recalibrated entirely around the concept of functional. Solis had stayed behind. Julian had sent her with instructions regarding the car and the tree line outside the Garden District property, instructions that were specific and did not require elaboration. Carver was outside now, doing a perimeter check with a flashlight he kept low to the ground. Julian set his laptop on the kitchen table and opened it, and the blue light of the screen filled the room with the particular flat illumination of people working in the middle of the night. Elena put the baby down in the carry basket they'd brought from the safe house and sat across the table from him and folded her hands on the tabletop like a woman settling in for a conversation she'd been waiting to have. "The name," she said. "On your phone. In the car. Who is it?" He'd known she was going to ask. He'd been deciding, during the 2-hour drive, how much of the answer to give her. He'd arrived at the conclusion that partial answers were going to cost him more than they saved, given that the situation had moved well past the point where managing her access to information served any useful purpose. "Vincent Crail," he said. She didn't recognize it. He could see that in the absence of any reaction. The specific blankness that comes before a name lands in context. "He operates a private capital management structure out of New Orleans," Julian said. "Legitimate on the surface. Underneath, he's spent the last 25 years building a network of financial instruments that essentially functions as a machine for locating and absorbing large frozen or dormant estates before their rightful claimants can assert control." He paused. "He's done it 11 times that I know of. The Whitmore Trust would be the largest by a factor of 6. "You said you had a prior relationship with him." 7 years ago, his network intersected with mine. We had a conflict of interest over a particular asset in the Lafourche Parish area. It was resolved." He stopped. "How?" "In the way that conflicts between men like us get resolved." He held her gaze. "I believe the resolution was permanent. The call tonight suggests I was wrong about the permanence." Elena absorbed this. "So he survived whatever you did?" "Apparently. And he's been building this Whitmore operation the whole time." "Longer than that. The Whitmore Trust would have gone on his radar the moment the legal freeze was formalized in 2003. That's 20 years of patience." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. "Which means Derek Vale didn't find you by accident, and he wasn't working alone from the start. He was recruited, placed, given a target and a timeline." She didn't flinch. He'd noticed that about her. The absence of flinching. Not numbness, not denial, but a kind of structural refusal to let information knock her off her feet before she'd finished processing it. 3 years, she said. What? Derek and I were together for 3 years, which means Crail's been running this specific operation for at least 3 years. She looked at the table surface. And the whole time I thought I was just living my life. You were living your life. You were also being positioned. There's a difference? To you, not to them. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what does Crail want? Specifically, walk me through the mechanics. Julian turned the laptop toward her and showed her the structure his people had been assembling over the past 12 hours, a diagram of entities and relationships that looked, on screen, like a map of a river delta. Each channel connecting to the next, water finding the lowest route to where it wanted to go. The trust releases to a confirmed blood descendant, he said, tracing the diagram. If no living descendant is confirmed within the next 18 months, the trust's final window before it transfers to a court-administered dissolution process, the assets enter a legal limbo that Crail's people have been specifically structuring to exploit. They have a judge in the dissolution pipeline. They have a legal team that's been preparing for this for years. If you and your daughter are confirmed dead, or if you never assert your claim, the money moves through channels they control and disappears into the same kind of fragmented structure that Crail uses for everything else. But if I'm alive, if you're alive and you assert the claim, the entire structure collapses, because the trust is unambiguous. A living descendant supersedes every other legal mechanism they've built. He paused. Which is why Derek needed you dead before you gave birth. A child complicates the lineage question considerably, but a living mother with a living child is unassailable. So they have a very specific problem, Elena said. Yes. And the solution to that problem is straightforward. He didn't answer that. She didn't need him to. She pulled the laptop toward her and looked at the diagram for a long time, following the lines with her eyes, and he watched her do it. Watched her build the map inside her own head the way he'd been building it since midnight. And he had the uncomfortable recognition that she was faster at this than most of the people he employed professionally. Harlan Fitch is 3 levels down, she said, pointing at the screen. But he's the one with direct access to our financial records, which means Crail has had a detailed picture of my finances, Derek's movements, everything. For how long? Minimum 18 months based on when Fitch opened that prepaid account. 18 months. She sat back. I found that phone 8 months ago. Yes. So Derek already knew I'd found it. He just calculated that I wouldn't act on it. He calculated correctly. For 8 months. She looked at him. Not with shame, not with self-recrimination, but with the specific clarity of a person who has finally finished lying to themselves about a thing and is now standing on the other side of that particular threshold, blinking in the unfamiliar light. Tell me about the DNA verification process, she said, for the trust claim. Standard genetic confirmation through a certified laboratory. Your bloodline through Catherine Whitmore, cross-referenced against the trust genetic registry, which was established when Gerald Whitmore set up the original documents. He paused. The registry is held by a law firm in Baton Rouge, Steele's firm, as it happens. Something crossed her face, quick and then gone. Steele, she said. The man who called you about the casualty inquiry. Yes. Is he Crail's or yours? Julian held very still for a moment. Then he said, He's been mine for 8 years. Has he ever worked with Crail? Not that I know of. She looked at him steadily. But you're not certain. He wasn't. He was aware that he wasn't, in the way that you become aware of a loose tooth gradually with a specific quality of unwillingness. Steele had called him fast, very fast, with very specific information about an inquiry that should have been several layers removed from anything Steele would have visibility into. Go to sleep, he said. I need to make some calls. Julian. What? If Steele is compromised, I said go to sleep. She held his gaze for 2 more seconds, making some internal calculation. Then she stood, picked up the carry basket with the sleeping baby, and walked to the back room without another word. He listened to the door close. Then he sat in the blue light of the laptop screen and stared at nothing, and let the geometry of the thing rearrange itself in his head. Steele had known about the Whitmore Trust Registry. Steele's firm held the genetic registry. Steele had called him within hours of the casualty inquiry being filed. He picked up his phone and called Solis. "The car from the safe house," he said. "The occupant. Where are we?" "Gone before I could make contact." Solis's voice was flat and professional. "Whoever it was, they moved the moment you left the property." "They knew we were gone." "Yes. Which means they had eyes on the back of the property as well." "That's my read." Julian closed his eyes for 1 second. Then, "I need you to pull everything you have on Steele. Phone records, financial activity, anything that moved in the last 6 months. Quietly." A pause on Solis's end. Brief, but loaded. She understood what he was asking and what it implied about the reliability of the architecture he'd been operating inside. "How fast?" 12 hours. "I'll need 10. "You have 10. He paused. "Solis, if Steele is dirty, I need to know before he knows I'm looking." "Understood." He ended the call and sat with the silence of the house and the dark and the distant sound of Carver's footsteps on the gravel outside doing the perimeter rotation that would go on until dawn, because Carver was the kind of man who did not leave gaps in a perimeter rotation. The baby made a small sound from the back room. A brief, half-conscious sound. Not a cry. Just the small acoustic evidence of a human being processing the first days of existence. He thought about Vincent Crail's voice on the phone, the smoothness of it, the patience underneath the smoothness. 20 years of patience, the kind that only develops in people who believe, with absolute conviction, that they will eventually get what they want. He thought about the fractional silence when he'd mentioned the car. Crail hadn't known about the car, which meant that whoever had put the car in the tree line outside Julian's safe house was not Crail, or was not only Crail, which meant there was another layer. He opened his laptop and started pulling the threads. By 7 in the morning, he had something. Not everything, not the complete picture, but enough of a shape to see what it was. The car outside the safe house had been positioned there before Crail's call, by at least 2 hours based on the timeline Carver had given him, which meant someone had known where Julian's safe house was before Crail did, which meant someone with independent access to information about Julian's operational properties had flagged the safe house location. That list was short, deliberately, structurally short. Carver, Solis, 3 other people in his organization who had operational knowledge of that specific property, and Steele, who had helped him acquire it 5 years ago through a shell entity and who had never in 5 years given Julian any reason to revisit that particular piece of trust. The Solis report came in at 9:47. 10 pages of financial and communication data assembled with the efficiency that made Solis worth what he paid her. He read it straight through without stopping. Then he went back to page 4 and read one section twice. Steele had received 3 wire transfers from a holding company in the Cayman Islands over the past 14 months. Total value, $800,000. The holding company was 2 layers removed from a parent entity that Julian's people had already flagged in the Whitmore Trust investigation. 1 layer above that parent entity was a name Julian hadn't seen in the diagram yet. It wasn't Crail. He sat with that for a moment. He heard Elena's door open and her footsteps in the hallway, and then she was in the kitchen doorway with the baby strapped to her chest in the carrier that Solis had packed. A practical, deliberate woman, always moving toward the next necessary thing. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "What did you find?" He looked at her and made a decision that a week ago he would not have made, which was to show her everything. He turned the laptop toward her and pointed at the name above the parent entity. She leaned in and read it. Her face did something complicated. A series of very small movements, each controlled, each costing her something. "I don't understand," she said. "Read the transfer dates," he said. "And then tell me if any of those dates are significant." She read them. He watched the recognition arrive in her face the way you watch a wave arrive. Not fast, but with an inevitability that makes the speed irrelevant. The first transfer, 14 months ago, 3 weeks after Elena had found the burner phone in Derek's drawer. The second, 9 months ago, the week after Elena's last prenatal appointment had been rescheduled due to a clerical error at the clinic. an error that had briefly put her medical records in transit between two systems and created a momentary gap in her documented address. The third? 6 weeks ago. 4 days after Elena's sister Renee had called Derek's cell phone directly, not Elena's, asking why Elena seemed withdrawn and whether everything was all right in the marriage. "Someone was tracking my movements," Elena said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "And reporting them." "Yes." "To whoever owns that entity." "Yes." She straightened up. She put one hand on the top of the baby's head, automatic, protective, and looked at Julian with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to remain composed. "Julian," she said, "that name." "I know. That's my sister's married name." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Julian watched it land on her and watched her hold the weight of it without going down, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that she wasn't already saying to herself in the silence that followed. Renee Castellan, née Whitmore, Elena's older sister. The woman Elena had tried to call during the storm, whose phone had gone unanswered for 9 hours, whom Elena had mentioned with the specific reflexive trust that people reserve for the family members they have never had reason to question. The name above the parent entity in Crail's financial structure. "She's been working with them," Elena said. Not a question. Her voice was level with the specific effort of a person keeping it level through force of will alone. "The transfer pattern suggests she was the primary intelligence source. She had access to your routines, your medical schedule, your relationship with Derek. She would have known when you were most vulnerable." Julian paused. "She may have been involved from the beginning, before Derek." Elena's hand stayed on the baby's head, stayed very still. "She called Derek," Elena said, 6 weeks ago. I heard the end of it. He said it was a business contact." A pause. "I asked him about it. He said I was being paranoid." "She was checking the timeline, confirming you were still in the property before the storm made landfall." "She didn't answer when I called from the shelter." "No." The silence stretched. Outside, a bird started and stopped in the live oaks. The baby shifted in the carrier, turning its face toward Elena's warmth. "She's my only family," Elena said. Julian didn't answer that. "She let me stand on that roof," Elena said. "She knew where I was. She knew there was a storm. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Her jaw was working in the tight, controlled way of someone fighting their own body's impulse to break. "Elena, don't." She put a hand up, flat. "Don't say something that's supposed to help. There's nothing that helps this." She breathed. 1 breath, 2, the same deliberate rhythm she'd used on the roof. "How long before Crail makes a move?" He recognized what she was doing. He understood the mechanics of it, the decisive pivot from what can't be fixed to what can still be controlled. He'd lived inside those mechanics for the better part of his adult life. "He'll move when he knows the casualty lists don't have your name," Julian said, "which means today. Maybe this morning. And Steele gives him our location. If Steele knows it, he doesn't. Not yet." He paused. "But Renee might." Elena's eyes closed for half a second. "I told her I was safe when I called from the shelter last night, before I knew." She opened her eyes. "I didn't tell her where I was, but she knows I'm with you." "Does she know who I am?" "I told her a man from a helicopter brought me in." A pause. "I didn't give her your name." "Then we have a window." Julian pulled the laptop back toward himself. Small, but real. "What do we do with it?" He thought. The situation had rearranged itself completely in the last 12 hours. Not once, but 3 times, each rearrangement removing another layer of assumed safety. What remained, stripped down to its actual components, was this: a woman with a legitimate claim to a fortune that powerful people had spent 20 years positioning to steal. A newborn child whose existence made that claim bulletproof. A network of enemies that now included someone Elena had believed was her closest ally, and Julian himself, whose own operational security had been compromised to a degree he was still mapping. What remained on the asset side was considerably shorter. Him, Carver, Solis, the timber frame house that nobody knew about yet, and whatever Elena Whitmore was capable of when the last of her assumptions about her own life had been burned away. He was beginning to think that last item was not negligible. I need to get you in front of a certified genetics lab, he said. The DNA confirmation is the foundation of everything. Once your claim is on record with the trust administrators, Crail's entire structure loses its leverage point. Without the prospect of the fortune entering dissolution, he has nothing to sell his investors. He paused. The lab that holds the Whitmore Genetic Registry is in Baton Rouge, Steele's territory, which makes it inaccessible to us directly. There are other certified labs. Yes, but the registry confirmation has to run through the original documentation. The trust is specific about the process. He looked at her. Which means we need to get access to the registry before Steele knows we're coming. How? I have a contact at the lab, not Steele. Someone in the records division who owes me a specific debt that has nothing to do with this situation. He paused. If I call in that debt, we can get the confirmation process started through a parallel intake that bypasses the standard notification chain. And if your contact talks to Steele first, then we lose the window and Crail knows exactly where to find us. She looked at him directly. You're telling me the plan requires trusting someone you're not sure about? Yes. After you've just found out that two people you were sure about were working against us? Yes. She exhaled slowly through her nose. So the plan is essentially a controlled gamble with bad odds. The odds are better than the alternative, which is staying here until Crail's people triangulate the location. He held her gaze. This is the window. It's not a good window. It's the window we have. Elena was quiet for a long moment. The baby made a small sound, shifting, and Elena looked down at her, and something moved through her face that was not strategic and not calculated. Something that had nothing to do with odds or windows or controlled gambles. Something that was simply a mother looking at the person she was doing all of this for. She looked back up. Make the call, she said. Julian reached for his phone. It rang before he touched it. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. A local Louisiana area code, clean, no associated identity in his contacts. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he answered and said nothing. A voice came through that was not Crail and not Steele and not anyone from his network. It was Derek Vale. I know where you are, Derek said. His voice was tighter than Julian had expected. Not the controlled smoothness of a man executing a plan, but the compressed, slightly too fast quality of a man who is frightened and trying not to show it. Not the exact location yet, but close enough. A pause. I need to talk to Elena. Julian looked at Elena across the kitchen table. She had heard the voice. He could see it in the stillness that came over her. Total, like a system going offline. He held the phone out. She looked at it. She looked at Julian. Then she took the phone and put it to her ear and said, with a quietness that was more frightening than anger would have been, Derek, Elena. His breath was audible, uneven. I need you to listen to me. I know you think you understand what's happening, but you don't have the full picture. Crayle, the people I've been working with, I didn't know what they were capable of. I didn't know they'd... He stopped. I didn't know they'd leave you in the storm. Yes, you did, she said. Silence on his end. You knew exactly what would happen to me, she said. You planned it down to the timing, the accounts, the car, 4 days before landfall. Her voice stayed flat and even and terrible. Don't insult me, Derek. Elena, I can help you. I have documentation, records of Crail's operation, financial traces, communications. I kept copies, insurance. His breathing was getting faster. But I need something from you in exchange. I know about Renee, she said. The silence on his end this time was different, longer. The silence of a man whose script has just been invalidated. Renee brought you to me, Elena said. She knew about my mother's family. She recruited you, or she introduced you to Crail, and Crail recruited you. Either way, she's been feeding them information about me for years. She paused. Did she know they were going to leave me to drown? More silence. Derek. Her voice dropped to something that had no temperature at all. Did my sister know? It wasn't supposed to go that far, he said. The plan was it was supposed to be clean, legal. You were supposed to be evacuated before the storm hit. Someone was supposed to make sure of that. Someone. Renee was supposed to call you to make sure you got out. His voice had a quality now that might have been genuine distress, or might have been the performance of it. She said she did. She said she called you and you didn't answer. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. Julian watched her knuckles go white. She didn't call me, Elena said. Silence. She didn't call me, Derek. The flatness in her voice cracked. Just once, a hairline fracture, and then sealed itself back up. She let me stand on that roof in the dark with a baby inside me, and she did not call. On the other end, Derek Vale said nothing. You said you have documentation, Elena said. Financial records, communications, proof of Krail's operation. Yes. Quick, relieved that she'd come back to something transactional. Everything. Enough to dismantle his entire structure. Where is it? I'll give it to you in person. I need to know I'm protected first. Where are you right now? She said. A pause. Why? She looked at Julian. Her eyes were clear and cold and asking a specific question that had nothing to do with words. Julian gave her the smallest nod. Because, Elena said into the phone, you're going to bring me everything you have. And in exchange, I'm going to make sure that when this is over, Krail's people understand that you cooperated. She paused. Which is the only version of this where you don't spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Another silence. Longer this time. A man weighing the only options left to him after his options had been exhausted. There's a gas station on Route 190 outside Livonia, Derek said finally. I can be there in 2 hours. We'll be there, Elena said, and ended the call. She set the phone on the table. She sat very still. Then she picked up the carry basket with the sleeping baby and stood and walked to the window and stood looking out at the live oaks in the gray morning light. And Julian watched her hold the full weight of what the last 20 minutes had delivered. Not bent by it, not broken, but absorbing it with a kind of physical determination that was nothing like acceptance and everything like resolve. If Derek is walking into a trap, she said without turning around, and he's using us to do it, to draw you out into the open. I know, Julian said. Then going to that gas station is exactly what Krail wants. I know. She turned from the window. So why did you nod? Julian looked at her steadily. Because Derek is frightened, and frightened men make mistakes when they're trying to be tactical. He paused. And because the documentation he has, if it's real, is worth the risk. It's the only thing that moves this from defense to offense. And if it's not real, then we walk into a very bad situation. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that he had not expected, that landed in the room with the quiet force of something that had been earned rather than decided. I spent 3 years being managed, she said. Derek managing me. Renee managing me. Krail's people managing the situation around me while I thought I was just living my life. She picked up the carry basket. I'm done being the person that other people make decisions around. She walked past him toward the hallway. Get Carver, she said over her shoulder. We leave in 30 minutes. Julian sat in the kitchen for a moment after she was gone, and he recognized, clearly, without particular comfort, that the woman who had come through that door 30 minutes ago was not quite the same woman who was now moving through the hallway, preparing to walk into a situation that had every structural component of a trap, and doing it anyway, because the alternative was continuing to be someone that the world moved around without asking. He picked up his phone and called Carver. Outside, the live oaks stood in the gray morning, and somewhere on Route 190, a frightened man was either about to save them or deliver them to the one person in Louisiana who had spent 20 years making sure that the Whitmore blood was worth more dead than alive. And Julian Romano, who had built his entire life on the principle of controlled outcomes, was driving toward a meeting whose outcome he could not fully control, beside a woman whose existence had already changed the geometry of everything he thought he understood about what he was willing to risk. The drive to Route 190 took 41 minutes. Nobody talked. Carver drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes moving between the road and the mirrors in a rhythm that never broke. Julian sat in the passenger seat with his phone on his knee and his jacket open and his right hand resting near his side in a way that was not accidental. Elena sat in the back with the baby in the carrier against her chest, one hand flat on the baby's back, and she watched the Louisiana landscape unreel through the window. The flat, wet fields, the standing water in the low spots, the debris lines left by the storm along the road shoulders where the flood had receded and left everything it had carried behind. She hadn't spoken since the house. Julian had used the drive to build what scaffolding he could. He'd sent Solis to the Baton Rouge genetics lab through a back channel that bypassed steel entirely. A direct contact in the records division named Maureen Ott, who owed Julian a favor so specific and so consequential that he'd never expected to use it, had held it in reserve for years the way you hold a single round when you're down to your last ammunition. Solis was moving. The appointment was being structured. If they got through the next 2 hours, the confirmation process could begin within the day. If. He'd also sent a message to a federal contact in the New Orleans field office, not a friend, not an ally, but a man who had a documented interest in Vincent Crail that predated Julian's own involvement and who had the specific professional motivation that federal agents have when they're 18 months into a financial crimes investigation and someone offers them a primary source with documentation. The federal contact had responded in 11 minutes. Talk to me first. Don't do anything until you talk to me. Julian had not talked to him yet. He was holding that card. The gas station on Route 190 outside Livonia was the kind of establishment that had stopped being primarily about gasoline sometime in the early 1990s and had since evolved into a combination of convenience store, hunting supply depot, and informal community hub for the surrounding area. It had 4 pumps, 2 of which appeared to be operational, a gravel lot that could hold maybe 12 vehicles, and sight lines in every direction that were clear for at least 200 yards before the tree lines closed in. Carver pulled into the lot from the south approach and did a slow circuit before parking, which took 40 seconds and which told them the following. A gray panel van parked along the north fence that had no business logo and no visible occupants. A blue pickup at the far pump that had been there long enough for the driver to have finished fueling and left if fueling was what they'd come for. And Derek Vale's rental car, a forgettable mid-sized sedan, Baton Rouge Airport, Julian recognized the category, parked close to the entrance of the store, driver's door facing out. Van, Carver said. I see it, Julian said. Pickup too. Yes. Elena leaned forward between the seats. How many? Can't confirm. Van has blacked rear windows. Julian scanned the lot without moving his head more than necessary. Derek's car is here. He's inside the store. Or someone is, Carver said. Julian opened his door. Stay with the vehicle. Julian, Elena started. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, Carver drives. He looked at her directly. Don't argue with me on this one. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she sat back. He crossed the gravel lot at a pace that was deliberate without being fast, his hands visible, his eyes doing the work that his posture was designed not to advertise. The pickup's driver was a man in his 50s in a hunting cap who appeared to be reading something on his phone and who did not look up when Julian passed, which meant either he was genuinely uninvolved or he was well-trained enough not to telegraph a look. Julian filed him in the uncertain column and went through the store's glass door. Derek Vale was at the back of the store near the refrigerated drinks section, which gave him a sight line to both the front entrance and the emergency exit at the rear. He'd chosen the position deliberately, which told Julian 2 things. Derek was more tactically aware than he'd allowed for, and Derek was genuinely frightened enough to think about exits. He looked worse than Julian had expected. 3 days of not sleeping well, and whatever the internal experience of running from the people you'd been working for looked like on the outside, which, in Derek Vale's case, was a man whose expensive casual clothes had been slept in and whose face had the specific gaunt quality of someone who had been eating adrenaline instead of food. He saw Julian and his eyes went to the door immediately, checking for Elena. She's in the car, Julian said, reaching him. Talk to me first. I wanted to talk to her. You'll talk to me. Julian stopped 3 feet away and kept his voice low and even. You have documentation. Show me. Derek's jaw worked. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a USB drive, which he held between two fingers. Everything's on here. 14 months of communications. Wire transfer records. The legal structure Krail's people built for the trust dissolution. Names. He paused. Including people you probably didn't know were involved. Julian looked at the drive without reaching for it. What do you want? I want out. Clean. I want documentation that I cooperated. You left your pregnant wife on a rooftop during a Category 4 hurricane. Derek's face did something complicated. That wasn't... He stopped. Renee told me she'd called. She said Elena was already out. You believed her? He exhaled. I wanted to believe her. Julian looked at him steadily. There's a difference between those two things. I know that. Derek's voice cracked slightly at the edge. I know what I am. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything except a way out that doesn't end with me in the ground. He turned the USB drive over in his fingers. Because the people I've been working with don't leave cooperating witnesses. I know that now. How long have you known it? Since the storm. Since I realized Renee hadn't called. He looked at the floor. Since I realized that the plan was never for Elena to be evacuated first. The plan was for her to be in the house when the water came. He looked up. I was supposed to be the grieving husband. File the death certificate. Let the legal clock run. Julian said nothing. I couldn't do it, Derek said. It didn't sound like a moral proclamation. It sounded like a man describing the edge of something he'd found he couldn't step over, and being slightly surprised at himself for it. I've done a lot of things. I couldn't do that. But you left anyway. I left because staying meant Krail's people would make sure I couldn't talk to anyone. About anything. He looked at Julian with something that was not quite asking for sympathy. More like presenting a set of facts and acknowledging their ugliness without attempting to polish them. I'm not a good person, Romano. I was paid to get close to Elena. I did it. I spent 3 years lying to her. A pause. But I didn't know Renee was going to... He stopped again. Give me the drive, Julian said. Derek looked at it. Then he looked past Julian at the front windows of the store, at the gray November light coming through the glass and the gravel lot beyond. The van, he said. Julian went still. The gray van, Derek said quietly. It was outside the motel where I spent last night in Maringuan. I thought I'd lost it on the drive here. He looked at Julian with the specific expression of a man delivering news he already knows is bad. I didn't lose it. Julian turned his head fractionally toward the front window. The van's driver door was open. How many people know you called me this morning? Julian said. Krail has my phone records. Derek's voice had dropped. He's had them the whole time. I've been running on borrowed time since I don't know how long. He pushed the USB drive into Julian's hand. Take it. It doesn't matter what happens to me if you take it. Julian took the drive and pocketed it in the same motion and turned toward the door. 3 men came through it. Not fast, not with the theatrical entry of people announcing themselves. They came through the door the way water comes through a crack, filling the available space, and 2 of them went left and right inside the entrance, and the third kept coming, a broad man in a dark work jacket whose face had the particular flatness of professional violence managed at low temperature. Julian's assessment took less than a second. No visible weapons yet, which meant either they were clean or they were being cautious about the store's cameras. He tracked the cameras, 2 visible, one behind the counter, one at the front corner. The counter attendant, a teenager who had been watching something on a phone, had gone very still. Mr. Romano, the flat-faced man said. Mr. Krail would like a conversation. Mr. Krail has my number, Julian said. He prefers in person. I'm not available today. The man's expression didn't change. That wasn't a request. Julian's right hand was at his side. His eyes moved once to the emergency exit at the back of the store, where Derek had been standing and was now not standing, because Derek had gone through it in the interval between Julian turning toward the door and the 3 men entering, which was either Derek saving himself or Derek doing something with specific purpose, and Julian did not have time to determine which. There are cameras in this store, Julian said. We're aware. Which means you're not planning to do anything in here. The flat-faced man's expression remained unchanged. We're planning to walk you out to the van. And then? And then Mr. Crail talks to you. A pause. The woman and the child complicate things. Mr. Crail understands that. He's prepared to be reasonable. Julian heard the word reasonable come out of this man's mouth in the same cadence that Crail had used it on the phone the night before, and he understood that it was a practiced word, a word that had been deployed many times in the management of situations like this one, meaning nothing except you have no leverage here. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. "Here's my position," Julian said. His voice was conversational. "I walk out of here with you and you have me. You don't have what's on the drive I'm carrying. You don't have Elena Whitmore's location. You don't have the federal contact I spoke to this morning, who is currently in possession of a preliminary brief on Crail's operation." He paused. "How reasonable does Crail want to be against that arithmetic?" The flat-faced man's jaw shifted slightly. One tell, one adjustment of calculation behind the flat eyes. "The federal contact," the man said. "New Orleans field office. 18-month investigation. Financial crimes and racketeering." Julian kept his voice even. "They've been building toward Crail for a long time. What I gave them this morning shortened that timeline considerably." It was partly true. He'd sent a preliminary brief. He had not confirmed the full details. But the man in front of him didn't know the difference between partly true, and Julian's delivery was giving him no assistance in making that determination. From the parking lot came a sound that resolved quickly into specific meaning. Tires on gravel, accelerating, moving east. He recognized the cadence of Carver's driving. The particular controlled urgency of a man who does not panic but understands that the parameters have changed. Elena was out of the lot. Something released a fraction in his chest, a fraction only. The flat-faced man had also heard the vehicle leave. His eyes moved to the window and back. "It's just you now," the man said. "Yes, Julian said. He let that sit for exactly the right duration. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, watching all three men track the movement, and produced not the USB drive but his phone, which he turned face out and showed the screen. The message that had buzzed while the flat-faced man was talking. Solace. Lab confirmed. Appointment 2 p.m. She needs to be there. And below it, from the federal contact, "Where are you? I'm moving." He let the flat-faced man see enough of the screen to understand the shape of what he was seeing without reading the specific content. Then he put the phone away. "I'm going to walk out of here," Julian said, "and none of you are going to stop me. Because stopping me right now, on camera, with federal movement already in progress, is the single worst decision any of you could make today." He looked at the flat-faced man with the directness that had ended more negotiations than any other tool he possessed. "Tell Crail that the window for reasonable is closing. He has until 2 o'clock. He walked toward the door. The two men on either side of the entrance didn't move. The flat-faced man said, "Romano." Julian stopped but didn't turn. "Crail has the sister," the man said. "He's had her since this morning. He says that changes your arithmetic." Julian stood very still. "He says Elena Whitmore can have her sister back," the flat-faced man continued, "when Elena Whitmore walks away from the trust claim." A pause. "He says you understand the mechanism. People walk away from things to protect family, even family that didn't protect them." Julian turned around slowly. The flat-faced man was watching him with the closest thing to expression he'd shown, a careful, calibrated watchfulness, reading Julian's face for the information that would tell him whether this leverage was as functional as Crail believed it would be. Julian thought about Elena in the car. Elena who had said she let me stand on that roof. Elena who had said, "Did my sister know?" with a voice that had cracked once and then sealed itself back up. Elena who had said, "I'm done being the person that other people make decisions around," and meant it in a way that you could hear in the structure of every subsequent sentence she'd spoken. "Tell Crail," Julian said, "that he's miscalculated the leverage." He pushed through the door. The gravel crunched under his feet, and the November air hit him, and he crossed the lot at the same deliberate pace, and he did not look back at the store, and he did not run. He reached the road and turned east and walked 200 yards to where Carver had pulled the SUV onto the shoulder behind a stand of scrub pine, engine running. He got in. Elena looked at him from the back seat. The baby was sleeping in the carrier. Her face read the situation off his expression before he said a word. "What happened?" she said. "We're going to the lab." He looked at Carver. "Route 10 East. Move." Carver moved. "Julian." Elena's voice was controlled. "What happened in there?" "Derek gave me the drive. 3 of Crail's men came in. I talked my way out." He paused. "Crail has Renee." Elena's breath went out of her slowly. "He's using her as leverage to get you to drop the trust claim," Julian said. He held her gaze and gave her the honest version, the complete version, because she'd earned it. "He's betting that blood loyalty is stronger than what Renee did, that you'll trade the inheritance for her safety." Elena looked at him for a long time without speaking. The SUV moved east on Route 190, the wet fields sliding past, the sky a flat gray that was neither threatening nor clear, just the aftermath of something that had already happened. "Is she safe?" Elena said. "Right now. As long as she's leverage, yes. And if I go to the lab and file the claim, she becomes less useful as leverage." He paused. "Which cuts both ways." She understood what that meant. He could see her understand it. "The documentation Derek gave me," Julian said. "If it's what he says it is, we have everything we need to give the federal contact a complete case. Once that's moving, once Crail is looking at federal exposure, the calculus on using Renee as leverage changes. Hurting her stops being an asset and starts being an additional charge. That assumes he behaves rationally. It does. Men who've spent 20 years believing they're untouchable don't always behave rationally when the ground moves." "No," Julian said. "They don't." She looked out the window. She put her hand on the baby's back, that same flat, deliberate pressure. "She's my sister," Elena said to the window. "I know." "She let me drown." Still to the window. "She looked at me and she made a choice, and the choice was the money." A pause. "And she's still my sister." Julian said nothing. He watched the road. "What would you do?" she said. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "If it were someone you cared about." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about what he would do. He thought about the various times in his life when a person he'd trusted had been used against him, and the various ways those situations had resolved, and the consistent thing that had been true in every one of them, that the people who used the ones you cared about as weapons were betting on your sentimentality overriding your judgment, and that every time you paid that ransom, you confirmed the bet and set the price for the next time. "I'd go to the lab," he said. She held his gaze. "And then I'd get her back," he said. Differently. Something moved through Elena's face. Not peace, not resolution, something harder and more functional than either. The look of a person who has decided to live inside an uncomfortable truth rather than trade it for a comfortable lie. "Drive faster," she said to Carver. Carver drove faster. The lab was a private genetics facility on the east side of Baton Rouge, unremarkable from the outside. A 2-story medical office building behind a parking structure, the kind of place that did paternity work and ancestry confirmation, and the occasional forensic contract, staffed by people who understood that their clients' reasons for being there were rarely simple and who had built a professional culture around not asking about the complexity. Solis was waiting at the side entrance when they arrived, with Maureen Ott, a compact woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the specific demeanor of a person who has been doing careful work for a long time and has no interest in drama, standing beside her. Maureen looked at Julian when he got out of the SUV. "You're calling in the favor," she said. "I'm calling in the favor." "This goes through the proper documentation chain, certified, court admissible?" "That's what I need." She looked at Elena, who had gotten out with the baby, and ran a quick professional assessment. "The child needs a sample too. Bloodline confirmation works better with 2 generations." "Fine," Elena said. "It'll take 3 to 4 hours to run the preliminary confirmation, the full registry cross-reference. How long for something that would stand up to a legal challenge?" Julian said. Maureen looked at him over her glasses. 24 hours for the preliminary, 72 for the full certification. "We need the preliminary on record today. Then come inside." She opened the door. "And stop standing in a parking lot." They went inside. The waiting area was quiet and clean and smelled of recycled air and something faintly antiseptic. Solis positioned herself near the entrance without being asked. Carver stayed with the vehicle. Julian sat across from Elena in the waiting area, while Maureen's staff prepared the intake, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the baby slept. Then Elena said, "The van from the gas station." He looked at her. "Did they follow us?" He'd been watching the mirrors since Route 190. "No. They let us go." "They let me walk out of there," he said. "They knew where we were going. Crail knows about the lab. He's known about the registry for years. He didn't need to follow us." He paused. "He's letting us start the process." "Why?" Julian looked at his hands. "Because he has something planned for before it completes." The silence that followed had the specific quality of two people sitting with a fact that neither of them can improve by discussing it. Elena said, "The USB drive." He took it out and looked at it. "I need a secure machine." "Maureen's office?" He hadn't thought of that. He stood and went to the intake desk and made the request, and Maureen, who had seen enough unusual things in her career to have developed a broad definition of normal, showed him to a back office with an air-gapped computer and left him to it. He plugged the drive in. It was real. Derek had not exaggerated. 14 months of communications, encrypted, but the encryption was the kind that his people could crack, the kind that Crail's network had used because it was industry standard good rather than intelligence agency good. Wire transfers with routing information, legal structure diagrams, names. And one file he hadn't expected, an audio file, recorded on what appeared to be a phone, the quality slightly compressed but clear. A conversation between two voices, one of which was Derek, and one of which Julian placed within 3 seconds, because the smoothness of it was the same smoothness he'd heard on the phone the night before. Crail. He listened. The conversation was 11 months old. Derek asking questions about the timeline. Crail answering with the particular patience of a man explaining something to a subordinate who needs reassurance. And in the middle of it, clear, unambiguous, the kind of thing that prosecutors build careers on. Crail explaining exactly what was supposed to happen to Elena Whitmore when the storm made landfall, and why, and what had been arranged to ensure it. Julian sat back. He copied the file to a secure transfer and sent it to the federal contact with one line of text. "This ends it. Call me." He was walking back to the waiting area when his phone rang. Not the federal contact, not Solis, not Carver. A number he recognized as belonging to the private line of a man named Garrett Crail, Vincent's younger brother, who Julian knew existed but had never directly engaged, who operated on the periphery of Vincent's network in a capacity that had always been vague enough to be deliberately vague. He answered, "Mr. Romano." The voice was not smooth, it was flat and precise, in a different way from the flat-faced man at the gas station. The precision of someone who has made a decision and is executing it cleanly. "My brother doesn't know I'm calling." Julian stopped walking. "Talk." "I know what's on that drive. I know because I gave Derek access to it." A pause. "I've been building that file for 8 months. Everything Vincent has done, organized for someone who could use it." Another pause. "I told Derek to bring it to you. I've been moving him in your direction for 2 weeks. Julian's hand tightened on the phone by a degree. "Why?" "Because Vincent is going to destroy the woman and the child regardless of what she does about the trust. She knows too much now. He doesn't leave witnesses." The precision in the voice was absolute, uninfected by anything that sounded like sentiment. "And because I've been done with my brother's operation for longer than I've been able to act on it." A pause. "The federal brief you sent this morning. It'll work. But not before tonight. Vincent is moving tonight." "What does tonight look like?" "He has the sister. He's going to use her to get Elena to a location he controls. The meeting will be framed as an exchange. Renee for Elena's signature on a trust disclaimer." A pause. "There will be no exchange." Julian was already moving back toward the waiting area. "Where?" "The Whitmore estate, outside Thibodeau. Vincent has had access to the property for 6 years through a caretaker arrangement, part of the legal structure around the frozen trust. He knows the building." The voice paused. He's chosen it specifically. He thinks the symbolism matters. When? He'll make contact with Elena in the next 2 hours. The meeting will be set for this evening, 9-10 o'clock. A pause. He'll want it dark. Garrett. Julian used the name deliberately, establishing that he'd been listening to the full content of what was being offered. Why tell me this? A silence. Longer than the others. The first silence from this voice that felt like something other than precision. Because I have a daughter, Garrett Crale said. She's 3 years old, and I've spent the last year watching my brother arrange the death of a woman I've never met, because she happened to be born with the right blood. Another pause. I'm done watching. Julian processed this. He processed it the way he processed everything, but not with trust, not with cynicism, but with the precise measurement of what it would cost to believe it and what it would cost not to. If you're running me into a position for Vincent, Julian started. I know what you'll do to me, Garrett said. I know exactly what you're capable of. I'm calling you anyway. A pause. That should tell you something. Julian ended the call. He went back to the waiting area. Elena looked up when he came through the door, and she read his face the way she always read his face. And she didn't ask what happened this time, because his face was already answering. He sat down beside her, close, lower than usual, so that he was speaking directly and quietly, and the intake staff across the room couldn't hear. He told her everything. Derek, Garrett, the audio file, the plan for tonight. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment with it. Then she said, He's going to use Renee to get me to the Whitmore estate. Yes. And when I get there, it ends, Julian said, one way or the other. That's what he's built the last 20 years toward. The place, the night, the heir who walks in and doesn't walk out. He held her gaze. He thinks the estate is his territory. Is it? Julian looked at her. The waiting room was quiet around them. The baby was sleeping. Somewhere in the building, a machine was running a genetic sequence that would, within hours, produce a document confirming what everyone in this situation already knew, that the blood in this room was real and the claim was real, and the only question left was who was going to be standing when the night was over. It was, Julian said. Elena held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the baby, who was sleeping with that same absolute commitment, fingers curled, breath even, completely unaware of the specific shape of the world she'd been born into and what it was going to require of the woman who had brought her into it. Elena looked back up. Then we need to get there first, she said. And the way she said it, quiet and direct and without a single wasted syllable, was the voice of a woman who had finished becoming whatever the storm and the rooftop and the 3 years of managed existence and the sister who had chosen money over blood had made her into. And what she'd become was something that Vincent Crale, in 20 years of patient planning, had never once thought to account for. They reached the Whitmore estate outside Thibodaux at 8:47 in the evening. Garrett Crale had been right about the timing. Vincent's message had come through to Elena's satellite phone at 6:15, a text from Renee's number, which meant Renee's phone was in Vincent's possession, which meant the message was Vincent speaking in Renee's voice the way he'd been speaking through other people's lives for 20 years. The text said, I'm sorry, please come. He says if you sign the papers, he'll let me go. Whitmore House, Route 308, 9 o'clock. Come alone. Elena had read it once and handed the phone to Julian without comment. Julian had spent the 4 hours between the genetics lab and Sunset doing 3 things simultaneously. He'd worked through the USB drive's contents with Solus, extracting the most actionable documentation and organizing it into a format that the federal contact, a compact methodical agent named Dwyer, who had driven down from New Orleans and met them in a gas station parking lot off Route 10 with the contained energy of a man who has been waiting 18 months for someone to hand him exactly this, could move on immediately. He'd coordinated with Garrett Crale on the estate's layout, the entry points, the location of the caretaker's quarters where Garrett said Renee was being held, and the number of men Vincent had brought with him, which was 4, not counting Vincent himself and a lawyer named Pell, who had been part of the trust dissolution structure for a decade, and who would be present to witness whatever documents Vincent intended to produce. And he'd had an argument with Elena that wasn't quite an argument, more like a sustained low-temperature confrontation between two people who each had a clear position and neither was going to be moved from it by volume. She was going in. He'd told her why she shouldn't. She'd told him why she was. He'd made the case 3 different ways. She'd responded to each case with the same patience and the same flatness and the same fundamental point, which was that Vincent Crail's entire operation was structured around the concept of Elena Whitmore being a passive element, a bloodline to be managed, a legal threshold to be crossed, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reckoned with. Walking into that estate was the last thing Vincent expected, which made it the only move that created genuine unpredictability in a situation that Vincent had been scripting for years. Julian had said, "You have a newborn daughter." Elena had said, "I know, that's why I'm going." He hadn't had an answer for that. Carver drove them in on the service road that ran along the east side of the property, an unpaved track behind a tree line that appeared on no public map and that Garrett had described in detail. The estate itself was visible through the oaks as they approached, a large antebellum-style structure that had been maintained in the specific way of a property under legal freeze, functional, clean, but unlived in, the kind of maintenance that keeps a building from deteriorating without ever making it feel inhabited. Lights were on in the ground floor east wing. 2 vehicles were parked at the front. Solis had the baby. This had been the hardest negotiation of the day, harder than anything involving Vincent Crail or federal agents or the mechanics of walking into a controlled situation. Elena had held the baby for a long time before handing her over, her face doing the thing it did when she was running a calculation that the numbers didn't make easy. And then she'd handed her to Solis and hadn't looked back because looking back was not something she could afford. Solis was 3 miles east with Dwyer's secondary team. If nothing came through on the check-in schedule, they would move at 10:15 regardless. Julian and Elena went in through the east garden entrance, a wrought iron gate that Garrett had left unlatched, and crossed the grounds in the dark with the wet grass silent under their feet. Garrett was supposed to be inside, positioned near the caretaker's quarters, which were in the north wing away from the main rooms where Vincent had set up. The plan, such as it was, had 3 components. Garrett would get Renee out of the north wing before the 9 o'clock meeting. Julian would position himself to cover the main room. Elena would walk in. Julian hated all of it. He'd built better plans in worse situations, and he knew it. But the truth that he'd stopped arguing against 2 hours ago was that Elena was right about the unpredictability. That the only asset they had in that building that Vincent Crail hadn't accounted for in 20 years of planning was the specific, unscripted human reality of Elena Whitmore deciding to be something other than what the script required her to be. They stopped at the east garden wall. He looked at her in the dark. "If anything changes, I know," she said. "If Garrett's position is compromised." "I know, Julian." He looked at her. Her face was pale in the darkness and set with the same carved stillness she'd had on the rooftop in the storm. That expression that was neither courage nor fear, but something that lived between them. The face of a person who has passed through the thing that was supposed to break them and found out it didn't. "The preliminary confirmation came through," he said. It had come in 40 minutes ago from Maureen's lab. A text to his phone, clean and official and already forwarded to Dwyer's office. The genetic registry cross-reference was complete. Elena's bloodline through Catherine Whitmore was confirmed. Her daughter was confirmed as secondary heir. The trust claim was on record. "I know," she said. "You told me. I'm telling you again because it means Crail has nothing to gain from tonight except revenge. Which means he's not thinking commercially anymore. He's thinking like a man who's lost," she said. "Yes. Men who've lost are more dangerous than men who think they're winning." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why did you stay? At the shelter. That first night. You could have left me with the medics and gone." He didn't answer immediately. He thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in a long time. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, too much weight in it for that, but something in the direction of recognition. "Okay," she said. She went around the wall toward the front entrance. He went through the east garden door. The inside of the estate smelled of old wood and cleaning product, and the particular stillness of a building that has been waiting a long time for someone to come back. Julian moved through the east corridor with his back to the wall and his footsteps calibrated for silence and his eyes adjusting to the low light that came from the main rooms ahead. He could hear voices. Two of them, both male. Neither was Vincent's. Staff or perimeter security moving through the interior. He found a position in the shadow of the doorway that connected the east corridor to the main hall, which gave him a sightline into the large room at the front of the house where the lights were on. Vincent Crail was already there. Julian had never seen him in person. The intelligence profile had photos, but photos compressed a person, flattened them into a two-dimensional fact. In person, Vincent Crail was a man in his mid-60s who wore his age the way men of sustained wealth and entitlement wear their age, which is to say lightly, with the particular physical confidence of someone who has never had to accommodate the world's indifference to their comfort. He was seated in a leather chair near the fireplace, unlit, but the chair was positioned facing it as if the fire were going, a choice of staging that struck Julian as revealing, with a glass of something dark on the table beside him, and a man Julian identified as Pell, the lawyer, standing near a side table where documents were laid out in a neat arrangement. Two of Vincent's men were visible in the room. Julian tracked them, one near the window, one near the main entrance. He placed the other two somewhere outside or in the northern wing and adjusted his calculation accordingly. Vincent checked his watch. 8:53. The front door opened at 8:58. Elena walked in. She walked in the way she'd walked through every space Julian had seen her walk through since the gymnasium, with a deliberateness that had nothing performative about it, the walk of a person who has decided where they're going and is going there. She stopped in the center of the room and looked at Vincent Crail and said nothing. Vincent studied her with the expression of a man examining something he has been trying to acquire for a long time. It was not quite triumph. Too much assessment in it still. But the edges of it were self-satisfied in a way that Julian, from the doorway, read as a man who believed this was already resolved. "Elena," Vincent said, "sit down." "Where's my sister?" Elena said. "She's comfortable. She'll stay comfortable as long as this conversation goes smoothly." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Elena didn't sit. She looked around the room once, unhurried, taking inventory the way Julian had watched her take inventory of every space she'd been in since the night he'd pulled her off the roof. Then she looked back at Vincent. "You've had 20 years, she said, "and a judge and a lawyer and 4 men with my sister and a husband you recruited and planted in my life," she paused. "And I still have more than you do." Vincent's expression adjusted by a degree, the self-satisfaction recalibrated into something cooler. "You have a preliminary genetic confirmation," he said, "which my legal team will challenge, which will take 18 months in court, during which time your daughter will be an infant being raised by a woman with no assets and no infrastructure, and a very public connection to Julian Romano, whose own legal exposure." "The audio file," Elena said. Vincent stopped. "Derek recorded you," Elena said, 11 months ago. You explained to him exactly what was supposed to happen to me during the storm, in detail." She held his gaze. "The federal field office in New Orleans has a copy. They've had it for 4 hours." The room changed. It didn't change loudly. There was no dramatic shift in posture or sound. But Julian, from the doorway, felt the atmosphere of it alter the way pressure changes before weather, something moving in the quality of the air. Pell, the lawyer, set down his pen. Vincent's face went through something that was not quite fear. A man like Vincent Crail did not arrive at fear quickly, but was its immediate predecessor, the rapid calculation of a person whose assumptions have just been structurally invalidated. "You're bluffing," Vincent said. "Dwyer," Elena said. "That's the agent's name. He drove down from New Orleans this afternoon." She paused. "You've been on his investigation for 18 months. He was waiting for a primary source with documentation. We gave him one." Another pause. "You're already done, Mr. Crail. The only question is what you do in the next 5 minutes." One of the men near the window shifted. Julian tracked the shift, a hand moving toward a jacket, and came through the doorway. "Don't," he said. His voice in the space was quiet and absolute, and the man near the window went very still. Vincent looked at Julian. A long look, The first look between two men who have been operating in each other's periphery for 7 years and are now, finally, in the same room. Julian saw the calculation in it, rapid, professional, a man running contingencies. And he saw the moment when the contingencies ran out. "You have 4 men in this building," Julian said. 2 in this room. I have people on the perimeter and a federal team 3 miles east that moves in 22 minutes, regardless of what happens here. He stopped walking when he was close enough that the distance was a message. "The math has been against you since 6 this morning. I think you know that." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. "Your mother," Vincent said. And the shift in his voice, the pivot to something that was almost conversational, made Julian's attention sharpen. "Did you know she came to me?" 2002. Before she died. She knew what I'd been building around the trust. She came to me and she asked me to leave it alone." Elena's expression didn't change. And I told her the trust was a legal matter and sentiment had nothing to do with it." He paused. "She said the money would destroy anyone who touched it with the wrong intentions. She said it like she meant something specific by it." He picked up the glass beside him and looked at it. "I've thought about that conversation a number of times in the last 20 years. "Did it change anything?" Elena said. "No." He set the glass down. "That's the honest answer. No." He looked at her with the specific, flat honesty of a man who has stopped managing his presentation because the presentation no longer serves any function. "I wanted the money. I built a machine to get it. I use people the way machines use components." A pause. "Your husband was a component. Your sister came to me. I didn't recruit her. She came to me with your mother's name and a knowledge of the trust structure that told me she'd been sitting on it for years, waiting to find a use for it. I gave her a use." Elena absorbed this. Her face stayed level. "Renee came to you." 3 years before Derek, yes." He looked at her. "I think she'd been building toward it since your mother died, since she understood what the name was worth." The silence in the room had the quality of something final. Not dramatic finality, but the quieter finality of a story reaching the last page, all the accumulated weight of it settling into the last few sentences. "Where is she?" Elena said. Vincent looked at one of his men and nodded once. Julian watched the exchange. He stayed ready. The man near the window moved to the door and disappeared, and 30 seconds later there were footsteps in the corridor, and Renee Whitmore Castellan came through the door. She looked nothing like Elena. Julian had thought they would look alike, sisters, same blood, some shared architecture of feature or expression. But Renee was taller and sharper in the bone structure, and she moved with a different quality entirely, something wary and contained that was not the same as Elena's stillness. Her stillness was chosen. Renee's was defensive. She stopped when she saw Elena. Elena looked at her. The distance between them was 10 feet, and it was also considerably larger than that. "Elena," Renee started. "Are you hurt?" Elena said. Renee blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't the question asked in that register. Flat, assessing, the voice of a woman taking practical inventory. "No," she said. "No, I'm not hurt." "Okay," Elena said. She didn't move toward her. She looked at her the way you look at something you've been trying to see clearly for a long time and are now, finally, seeing. "I have things to say to you. I'm not going to say them here." A pause. "You're going to come with me. And then we're going to have the conversation we should have had a long time ago." Renee's jaw was working. Her eyes were wet, which might have been relief or guilt or the specific misery of a person who has been found out and is discovering that the exposure is both worse and less than they imagined. "I didn't know about the storm," she said. "I want you to know that. I didn't know what they were planning." "Renee." Elena's voice was quiet and final. "Not here." Renee closed her mouth. From somewhere outside the building came the sound of vehicles. Not fast, not dramatic, but multiple engines and the specific cadence of organized movement. Julian glanced at his watch. 9:18. Dwyer was early, which meant Dwyer had been closer than 3 miles. Vincent heard it too. He sat very still in the leather chair, his hands on the armrests, his face composed with the particular composure of a man who has accepted the shape of the moment and is deciding how to inhabit it. Pell, the lawyer, picked up his briefcase. "Sit down," Julian told him. Pell sat down. The front door of the estate opened and Dwyer came through it with 2 agents behind him and the specific low-intensity controlled energy of a federal officer executing an arrest that has been built over a long time and is going to be done correctly. He looked at Vincent Crail. He looked at Julian. "Romano," he said. "Dwyer," Julian said, "you're going to have a very detailed conversation with my office." "I know." "Not tonight," Dwyer said with the practical fatigue of a man who has a full night already. "Tomorrow." He looked at Elena. "Ms. Whitmore, I'll need a statement. Also, not tonight." He looked back at Vincent. "Mr. Crail, please stand up." Vincent stood. He straightened his jacket, which was a small automatic gesture of dignity that Julian found unexpectedly human. He looked at Elena one more time. "Your mother was right," he said, "for whatever that's worth." Elena said nothing. She watched them take him out of the room, and Pell after him, and the men from the windows after them, and then the room was quiet, and there was only the sound of the vehicles outside, and Dwyer's people moving through the property, and the distant, neutral sound of the Louisiana night coming through the walls. Renee was standing near the door. She hadn't moved. Julian looked at Elena. She was looking at the fireplace, the unlit fireplace, the cold grate, the stage chair that Vincent had been sitting in as if performing a version of belonging to a place that had never been his. "Go outside," she said to Julian, quietly. "Give us a minute." He went. The night was cool and wet, and the grounds of the Whitmore estate smelled of storm runoff and old grass and the specific green darkness of the Louisiana lowland at night. Julian stood on the East Garden path and looked up at a sky that had cleared completely since the storm, the first clear sky in what felt like much longer than the actual number of days. And he breathed and let the various tensions of the last 24 hours do what they did when the immediate emergency had passed, which was not resolve cleanly, but redistribute themselves into a lower-grade awareness that he understood would take time to fully process. Carver appeared at the garden gate. "Clean," he said. "4 of Crail's people in custody. Garrett is with Dwyer's team." "How's Garrett?" Carver shrugged. "Talking, like someone who practiced what they were going to say." He paused. He gave them everything, 18 months of documentation. He built the file. "Yeah." Carver looked at the house. "What happens to him?" "That's Dwyer's calculation." Julian paused. "He turned on his brother. He'll get something for that." He didn't elaborate on what something might look like. It wasn't his calculation to make. His phone buzzed. Solis. "All clear. Coming in." He typed back, "South entrance." 8 minutes later, Solis walked through the south garden gate with the carry basket and the baby inside it, sleeping with the same untroubled commitment that had characterized every moment of her first days of existence. And Julian took the basket from Solis and stood in the garden of the estate that the baby's blood entitled her to, and looked at the face of the child who had been born into a storm and had, so far, found the whole thing entirely manageable. He was still standing there when Elena came out. She stopped when she saw him holding the basket. She looked at the baby first, the way she always looked at the baby first, checking, present, breathing, warm. And then she looked at Julian. He held the basket out. She took it and settled it against her and stood beside him and looked at the house. "Renee," he said. "She's inside. She'll stay tonight." A pause. "She did come to Crail first. He wasn't lying about that." Her voice was carefully modulated, not emotionless, but controlled, the voice of someone who is doing the work of holding a complicated thing without letting it hold them. "She found our grandmother's trust documents in my mother's things after she died. She'd known for years. She sat on it for a long time trying to figure out what to do with it." A pause. "She was angry at my mother for cutting ties with the family money. She thought we deserved it. She thought—" Elena stopped. "She told herself she was trying to get us what we were owed. For a while, maybe she even believed that. And then it became something else. And then it became something else." Elena looked at the clear sky above the tree line. She didn't call me during the storm. She's told me 3 different versions of why in the last half hour. A pause. I think the real version is that she couldn't make herself call, and she knew what that meant about who she'd become, and she couldn't look at it directly. She was quiet for a moment. So she didn't call. Julian said nothing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, Elena said. You don't have to know tonight. She looked at him. Is that something you know from experience? Not knowing what to do with someone who failed you? Yes. What did you do? He thought about it honestly. Usually I removed them from my life and moved on. And did that work? He thought about that too. It was efficient, he said, something in Elena's face that was almost a smile, and was also not. I can't remove Renee from my life, she said. She's the only person left who knew my mother. She looked back at the house. That's inconvenient. He understood what she meant. The specific, terrible inconvenience of needing someone who had failed you in a way that was hard to come back from. Needing them not for what they'd done, but for what they carried that nobody else did. Memory, history. The irreplaceable specific knowledge of a person who was gone. Inconvenient doesn't mean impossible, he said. She was quiet for a while. The baby made a small sound and settled back into silence. In the house, lights moved as Dwyer's team worked through it. Somewhere down the south approach, car doors opened and closed. The estate, Elena said. What about it? I don't want to live here. She said it simply, without particular drama. It's been someone else's battlefield for 20 years. I don't want to raise my daughter in it. She looked at the building, the well-maintained shell of a family that had been erased and spent decades as a legal abstraction, and was now, finally, resolved into something actual. But I don't want to sell it either. There's something wrong with selling it. What will you do with it? She was quiet for a moment. There are organizations that do crisis housing. For women with children who have nowhere to go. She paused. I was on a rooftop 5 days ago with nothing. I know what that feels like when you're looking down at floodwater and you don't know if anyone's coming. She looked at him sideways. Not everyone gets a helicopter. He looked at her. That's a significant undertaking. Yes. She looked back at the house. I'll need lawyers, financial infrastructure, people who know how to administer something like that. A pause. I'll need someone who knows how institutions operate at a level that doesn't show up in the public record. He understood what she was indicating. He turned it over in his mind, not quickly, but with the kind of real consideration that the question deserved. That's a different kind of work than what I do, he said. I know. It would require changes to how I operate. I know that too. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm asking if the person you are is capable of pointing in a different direction. He held her gaze. The question was the most serious one anyone had asked him in a long time. And it was serious because it wasn't a challenge or a demand. It was a genuine inquiry, the question of someone who was actually willing to accept either answer and operate accordingly. He thought about what he'd built over 20 years, the architecture of it, its functions, and its costs. He thought about what it had produced and what it had consumed and what he had at the end of it that was actually his. He didn't arrive at a clean answer. Clean answers had stopped being available to him at some point in the middle of the last several days, replaced by something more complicated and less comfortable that might, if he was being honest with himself, be more accurate. I don't know, he said. I know I'm still here. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the house and said, That's enough for tonight. They stood in the garden as Dwyer's people finished their work inside, and the vehicles on the south approach began to thin, and the Louisiana night settled into the particular deep quiet of a rural place after something loud has happened and finally stopped. The baby slept. The sky held its stars with the indifference of things that have been there long enough not to be impressed by human urgency. Julian thought about the phone call he'd need to make to Dwyer's office in the morning. He thought about the structural unwinding of his operation that the federal relationship would require. Not all of it, and not fast, but real and non-negotiable. The kind of change that doesn't happen cleanly, but happens. He thought about what the version of himself that came out the other side of that process might look like, and found that he couldn't see it clearly. which was unfamiliar in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Elena said, "I'm going to need to name her." He looked at her. "The baby. I've been calling her the baby." She looked down at the carry basket. "I've been afraid to name her. Like naming her was presuming something I wasn't sure I was going to get to presume." She was quiet. "Catherine," she said. "I think Catherine." Julian looked at the name settling over the child in the basket, the name of a woman who had cut ties with a family fortune and raised her daughters without it, and had come to a man in 2002 and told him that money taken with wrong intentions destroys everyone it touches, and had been right about that, and had not lived to see the proof of it. "It's a good name," he said. Elena nodded. She didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did he. That was all right. Somewhere in the house, Renee was sitting with whatever the night had left her with. The wreckage of a plan she'd started and couldn't finish, and the particular loneliness of a person who has looked at what they became in pursuit of something they told themselves they deserved, and found it did not look the way they imagined it would. That reckoning was hers to make. Elena had said what she'd said to her and left the rest in the space between them, where it would sit until one of them was ready to pick it up again. Maybe a long time. Maybe not forever. The specific, inconvenient complication of blood and memory and the people who carry the things nobody else carries. Derek Vale was in federal custody by 10 o'clock that night. Dwyer's team had picked him up at a motel in Maringuan where he'd been waiting, not quite running, in the manner of a man who had handed over the thing that mattered, and was now simply waiting to see what it bought him. The documentation and the audio recording bought him a cooperation agreement that would take months to formalize and would result eventually in something less than what he deserved and more than he'd had any right to expect. He would not go back to Elena. He had enough self-awareness left to understand that the distance between the man who had appeared at her door 3 years ago and the man in that motel room was not recoverable territory. Harlan Fitch was arrested at his Garden District office the following morning, his client list and financial records already in the possession of a federal forensic accounting team that had been waiting for exactly this for the better part of 2 years. His cooperation was immediate and comprehensive in the practiced manner of a man who had always known this day was a possibility and had prepared accordingly. Garrett Crale spent 4 hours with Dwyer's team that night and then was driven to a federal facility in Baton Rouge where the terms of his cooperation were formalized over the next 2 weeks. His daughter, 3 years old, unaware of the specific gravity of the inheritance she would carry from her father's choices, was with her mother in Metairie, which was where she stayed. Garrett's future was the kind of future that gets built inside the constraints of what you owe, and he seemed, by all accounts, to understand that and to have accepted it with the specific peace of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. Vincent Crale did not cooperate. This was consistent with everything Julian knew about him. The particular pride of a man who had spent 20 years building something invisible and found that his primary response to its destruction was not remorse but a cold, sustained refusal to give the people who had undone it the satisfaction of his acknowledgement. He was charged on 12 counts. The federal case was, Dwyer told Julian in their meeting the next morning, the cleanest thing his office had built in a decade. The documentation from Derek's drive was meticulous. The audio file was unambiguous. Vincent Crale would spend the remainder of his life in a federal facility, and the machine he'd built would be dismantled piece by piece over the following years by accountants and prosecutors who found, as they went deeper into its architecture, that its reach was considerably broader than even Julian had understood. The Whitmore Legacy Trust was formally unlocked 6 weeks after Elena's genetic confirmation was certified. The process required 2 court appearances, 3 rounds of legal documentation, and a sustained engagement with a financial and legal infrastructure that Elena had to build almost from scratch around herself. She hired people, learned things, made mistakes, corrected them, and moved forward with the stubborn, non-linear practicality that had characterized everything she'd done since the night she'd climbed out of an attic window into a storm. Maureen Ott's certification was not challenged. The trust administrators, operating under instructions Gerald Whitmore had written into the documents 40 years before, released the assets to the confirmed heir with the clean efficiency of a mechanism that had been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. The estate on Route 308 outside Thibodaux became, by the following spring, a functioning transition residence for women and children displaced by domestic violence and economic crisis. Elena hired a director with 20 years of nonprofit experience and a board of advisors that included 2 lawyers, a financial planner, a social worker, and, in a capacity that nobody quite had a clean title for but that everyone understood was real, Julian Romano, who attended quarterly board meetings in a building that had once been his adversary's operational base and sat at a table with people whose work was entirely unlike anything he had spent his career doing, and contributed to it in ways that were also unlike anything he had spent his career doing, and found that the combination of discomfort and purpose was not a contradiction, but simply the actual texture of change. He did not make a clean transformation. He did not wake up one morning a different man. The process was slower and less linear than that, and it involved more than one difficult conversation with Dwyer, and more than one structural adjustment to his operations, and more than one night of sitting with the reality that the thing you've built for 20 years is not the same as the thing you want to have built, and that the distance between those 2 things cannot be covered quickly and cannot be covered without cost. But he moved. In the direction of the thing. That was the honest account of it. Elena did not make a clean transformation either. She had a sister who had chosen money over her blood and had stood at the edge of watching her drown, and that fact did not become smaller with time. It became more specific, more textured, more intricately difficult in the way that the hardest truths about the people you love become more rather than less complicated as you live with them. She and Renee talked. Not once, not cleanly, but over months and in fragments, the way real repairs happen. Not a single moment of resolution, but an accumulated series of smaller moments, some of them failing, some of them not. Renee was not forgiven in the sense of the debt being canceled. She was, and Elena used this word deliberately, in a conversation with Julian 6 months after the estate, on the porch of the house outside Baton Rouge where Elena had settled herself and Catherine. She was carried. The way you carry something heavy that you've decided you're not going to put down, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is letting it go and losing the thing it contains along with the weight of it. Julian heard that and didn't say anything, and Elena looked at him with the look she'd been giving him since the rooftop, direct, reading him without apology, and said, "That's a foreign concept to you." "Yes," he said. "Does it make sense?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "But I think I understand it the same way I understand things in a language I don't speak." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "That's more than most people get to." Catherine was 7 months old by then. She had Elena's eyes and a temperament that seemed to have arrived fully formed, serious, watchful, entirely unimpressed by anything that wasn't immediately relevant to her needs. She looked at Julian when he was around with the unfiltered assessment of a creature that has not yet learned to manage its attention for social reasons, and he found this unexpectedly one of the least uncomfortable forms of being looked at that he'd encountered in a long time. Elena watched him hold her once, the first time on the porch, when she'd put Catherine into his arms, with the practical confidence of a woman who had stopped being uncertain about what she was doing, and she watched his face do the thing it had done in the gymnasium on the night Catherine was born, that thing that Carver wouldn't have recognized, and she didn't comment on it. She let it be what it was. The water that had covered the Louisiana coastline during Hurricane Celeste receded, as water does, and left behind the evidence of where it had been, the debris lines, the silt on the road shoulders, the damage to structures that would take years to fully repair, and some that would not be repaired at all. The farmhouse on Route 12 outside Delacroix was condemned that winter, the foundation compromised beyond what restoration would justify, and it was demolished in February. Elena drove past the lot once and looked at the empty rectangle where the building had been and felt nothing that she could name precisely. Not grief, not relief, but something that occupied the space where both of those would have been if she'd been a different person standing in a different position relative to what had happened there. She was not a different person. She was exactly herself. That was the thing the storm had taken from her briefly and given back. Not safety, not certainty, not the comfortable management of what could be expected from the world and the people in it. Just herself. The version of herself that had been there before Derek and the management of herself that living with Derek had required. Only harder now and more specific, and without the softening of illusions she'd been carrying about the fundamental reliability of the people who were supposed to love her. She had her daughter. She had a name that meant something and the resources to make it mean something beyond what it had been. A fortune that had been frozen and fought over and used as an instrument of harm, now redirected into the specific, unglamorous daily work of making it possible for people with nothing to have somewhere to go. She had a man who attended quarterly board meetings and held her daughter with an expression that Carver still wouldn't have recognized, and who did not know, on most days, exactly who he was becoming, but who showed up anyway. On the porch, at the table, in the difficult conversations, in the early mornings when Catherine woke before dawn and the house was dark and quiet, and something like a future was being assembled in the particular incremental way that futures get assembled, not in the dramatic moments, but in the space between them, in the presence of two people who had both stopped running from the thing they'd been running toward without knowing it. The helicopter sat in a hangar outside Chalmette. Julian had not flown it since the night of the storm. He'd thought about selling it. He hadn't. It sat in the hangar with the kind of patience that machines have, which is the patience of things that simply wait without needing to understand why. And when Elena asked him once why he hadn't sold it, he'd looked at the question from several angles before landing on the answer that was most true. "It's the first useful thing I did with it," he said. She looked at him. "Flying into a hurricane." "Finding someone in a hurricane," he said. "That's different." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out at the flat Louisiana landscape, the water and the fields and the wide sky that held both weather and the absence of weather with equal indifference. And she did not say anything else. She didn't need to. Some things get said once correctly, and that's enough. The rest gets lived.